My name's Mark Davis, and if you told me a year ago that I'd be standing where I am now, divorced, bruised, and far warier of the world, I'd have laughed it off. Pam and I had been married for 7 years, and for the most part, life was good. Or so I thought. We met in college, where she was the confident, free-spirited girl who seemed to brighten every room she entered. I was the guy who stayed in the background, content to let others take the spotlight. Somehow, she noticed me. Somehow, we clicked. Those early years were filled with laughter, late-night road trips, and dreams of a shared future. Fast forward to last year, though, and something began to shift. Pam was always social, but now she was out more often than usual, always a work thing, or a girls' night. She started dressing differently, more daringly, and while I tried to pass it off as just her exploring a new style, a knot of doubt formed in my gut. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, marriages have ups and downs, don't they? But then there were the late-night texts she wouldn't let me see and the sudden disinterest in our time together. Our conversations felt forced, her smiles less genuine. It wasn't long before I found myself wondering, was it all in my head, or was there something deeper lurking beneath the surface? I wish I could say I trusted her completely. I wish I'd never needed to question it. But as the days turned into weeks, those doubts became harder to ignore. Looking back now, the signs were everywhere, I just didn't want to see them. That's how it all began, the quiet unraveling of everything I thought I knew. And even as I tell this now, I can still remember the ache of realizing the life we'd built might be little more than a fragile illusion. It was one of those nights that start off ordinary. Pam told me she had a work dinner, some networking thing at a fancy restaurant across town. She kissed me on the cheek before she left, but even that felt different, mechanical, like a habit rather than an expression of love. I remember watching her leave, a strange sense of unease settling over me. I tried to shake it off. I watched some TV, had a couple of beers, and told myself I was being ridiculous. But as the hours ticked by, I couldn't help but notice how late it was getting. Midnight came and went, and Pam still hadn't come home. She wasn't answering her phone either, which wasn't like her. That's when I started to piece together the puzzle I hadn't wanted to see. The unexplained charges on the credit card, dinners at places we'd never been together. The way she suddenly started guarding her phone, setting it face down on the table and taking it with her everywhere. The nights she came home smelling of a cologne that wasn't mine. And then there was her newfound obsession with the gym, something she'd never cared much about before. I'd been trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, but that night, something in me snapped. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. When her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter earlier that week, I couldn't resist glancing at the screen. The name Mike G flashed up, a name I'd never heard her mention before. The message preview was short, but it told me everything I needed to know. Can't wait to see you tonight. My stomach dropped. I didn't say anything then, hoping I could somehow catch her in the act instead of confronting her without proof. That's how I ended up sitting in my car outside the restaurant she'd mentioned that night, waiting like some kind of amateur detective. Sure enough, Pam wasn't inside. My heart pounded as I drove around aimlessly, unsure of what to do next. Then I spotted her car parked outside a dingy little bar on the edge of town, a place I knew she'd never go for networking. My hands shook as I pulled into the lot. The bar's neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a sickly red glow over the scene. I couldn't bring myself to go inside right away. Instead, I waited, watching through the window as she sat at a corner table with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, burly, and rough-looking, exactly the type she used to joke about never finding attractive. They were laughing, leaning in close, and the way his hand rested on her knee told me everything I needed to know. The pain was like a punch to the gut. I'd always thought infidelity was something that happened to other people, the kind of drama you read about in gossip magazines or hear about from friends of friends. But there it was, right in front of me, tearing apart the life I thought we'd built together. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind raced with a million questions, each one more painful than the last. How long had this been going on? Was it something I did, or didn't do, that pushed her away? Was any of it real, or had she been lying to me all along? I didn't go inside that night. I didn't trust myself not to explode, and I wasn't ready to face her yet. Instead, I drove home in a daze, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. The house felt cold and empty when I walked in, as if it already knew the truth I'd just uncovered. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the dark, staring at the clock and waiting for Pam to come home, rehearsing over and over what I'd say when she walked through the door. But when she finally did, she acted as though nothing was wrong. She slipped off her heels, kissed me on the forehead, and headed straight to the shower, humming a tune I didn't recognize. I didn't confront her then. Not yet. I needed time to figure out my next move, to process what I'd seen and decide how to handle it. But in that moment, as I sat there in the silence of our home, I knew one thing for sure: life as I knew it was over. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I even wanted to fix it. I couldn't keep it bottled up forever. The knowledge burned inside me, eating away at every shred of patience I had left. For 2 days, I tried to act normal, even as I caught myself staring at Pam across the dinner table, wondering how she could sit there so casually while carrying on her betrayal. The confrontation came on a Friday night. She was getting ready for another work dinner, slipping into a little black dress I hadn't seen before. Her hair was done up, and she'd spent more time than usual perfecting her makeup. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her fasten her earrings, and something inside me snapped. "Who's Mike?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She froze, her hand mid-air as she reached for her perfume. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Pam. I know. I've seen the texts, and I saw you at that bar." The color drained from her face, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. But then, just as quickly, she recovered. Her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms, staring me down like I was the one in the wrong. "You were spying on me," she shot back, her voice laced with indignation. "Spying?" I laughed bitterly. "You've been sneaking around behind my back, and you're mad at me for catching you? Don't turn this around on me, Pam. I deserve the truth." She sighed, looking away as if the ceiling held some kind of answer. "Fine. You want the truth?" "Yes, I've been seeing someone. But it's not what you think." "Oh, really? Then what is it, Pam? A friendship? A mentorship? Because it sure looked like more than that when his hand was on your thigh." Her lips tightened into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it outright. But then she shook her head and muttered, "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. Things haven't been good between us for a while, Mark. You have to admit that." I stared at her, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and disbelief. "So this is my fault? You cheat on me, and I'm the problem?" "I'm not saying that," she said quickly, though the guilt in her eyes told a different story. "But maybe if you paid more attention to me, if you weren't so focused on work all the time, I wouldn't have felt so neglected." Her words hit like a slap to the face. Neglected? I'd worked my ass off to provide for us, to give her the life she always said she wanted. And now she was using that as an excuse to justify her affair. "That's low, even for you," I said quietly, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You could have talked to me, Pam. You could have told me you weren't happy, and we could have worked on it. But instead, you went behind my back. Do you even realize what you've done to us? To me?" She looked away, biting her lip. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Mark. I swear. It just happened." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "That's a hell of an excuse, Pam. Affairs don't just happen. You made a choice. And now you've destroyed everything. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of her betrayal hanging between us like a storm cloud. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she finally looked at me, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "But it wasn't enough. Not even close." "Sorry doesn't fix this," I said, my voice cold. "Sorry doesn't erase the lies, or the nights you spent with him, or the fact that you looked me in the eye every day and pretended everything was fine. Sorry doesn't change the fact that you've broken something I don't think we can ever get back." She started to say something, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't. Just, don't. I need some air." Without waiting for her response, I turned and walked out of the room, out of the house, and into the cool night. My mind raced as I paced up and down the driveway, my emotions swinging wildly between rage, heartbreak, and disbelief. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, had shattered it all with a single choice. And for the first time since I'd seen her at that bar, I realized the full extent of what I'd lost. It wasn't just her. It was trust. It was security. It was the future I thought we were building together. And in that moment, standing under the dim light of the porch, I knew there was no going back. After the confrontation, I felt hollow, like the wind had been knocked out of me and left me gasping for something solid to hold on to. Pam's betrayal wasn't just a crack in the foundation of our marriage, it was a wrecking ball that reduced everything we'd built to rubble. The first night after she admitted to the affair, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the same bed with her. I grabbed a blanket and slept on the couch, if you could even call it sleep. My mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying every moment of our marriage, every red flag I'd ignored, every laugh we'd shared, now tainted by the knowledge of her infidelity. I swung wildly between emotions, rage, sadness, confusion, self-doubt. Some moments, I wanted to scream at her, to make her feel the same gut-wrenching pain she'd caused me. Other moments, I wanted to break down and cry, mourning the loss of the life I thought we had. And then there were the questions. Endless, torturous questions. Was I not enough? Did I fail her somehow? Was it my fault that she turned to someone else? Every thought chipped away at my sense of self, leaving me feeling smaller and weaker with each passing hour. The hardest part was the silence. Pam avoided me as much as possible, retreating to the bedroom and shutting the door behind her. When we did cross paths, she looked at me with a mix of guilt and pity that made my stomach churn. It felt like she'd already checked out, like she'd already decided we were over, even if she hadn't said the words out loud. I tried to distract myself. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects and staying late at the office just to avoid going home. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the weight of what had happened followed me everywhere. It was there in the quiet moments, in the spaces between emails and meetings, in the empty seat next to me at dinner. Friends and colleagues noticed the change in me. They'd ask if I was okay, and I'd force a smile, saying I was just tired or stressed. I wasn't ready to tell anyone the truth, not because I wanted to protect Pam, but because admitting it out loud made it all feel more real. Nights were the worst. I'd lie on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying every argument, every misunderstanding, every moment when I might have missed the signs. I felt like a failure, not just as a husband but as a person. How had I been so blind? How had I let this happen? But underneath all the pain, a seed of something else began to grow. Anger. Not the kind that burned hot and fast, but the slow, simmering kind that settles deep in your chest and refuses to go away. I was angry at Pam, of course, angry at her lies, her betrayal, her audacity to blame me for her choices. But I was also angry at myself for not seeing it sooner, for letting her walk all over me, for holding on to something that had clearly been slipping away for far longer than I wanted to admit. The pain and anger fed off each other, creating a storm inside me that I didn't know how to control. I felt like I was drowning, like I was losing myself in the aftermath of her betrayal. And in a way, I was. The person I'd been before, the trusting husband, the optimistic partner, the man who believed in love and loyalty, was gone. But even in the darkest moments, a small part of me refused to give up. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Whether it meant fighting for my marriage or walking away, I had to make a choice. And for the first time in weeks, I started to feel a flicker of clarity. Pam's actions had shattered my world, but they didn't have to define me. This pain, this anger, it was temporary. It had to be. I just didn't know how to move forward yet. It took me about a week after the confrontation to realize that staying in this state of limbo, living under the same roof, barely speaking, avoiding each other, was slowly killing me. I couldn't live like that. I needed to take control of the situation, not just for my own sanity but to start rebuilding the life Pam had shattered. The first step was clarity. I sat down with myself one night, journal in hand, and wrote out everything I was feeling. I spilled my anger, my sadness, my questions, and even my lingering love for the woman I thought Pam was. By the time I finished, the pages were filled with a mess of words, but amidst the chaos, one truth stood out: this marriage was over. It wasn't just the affair. It was everything leading up to it: the lies, the excuses, the way she avoided taking responsibility. I realized I couldn't trust her anymore, and without trust, what was left? Staying together would only prolong the pain and resentment. I didn't want to live in a house full of ghosts. The next morning, I told Pam my decision. She was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, when I walked in. I sat across from her, my heart pounding in my chest but my mind oddly calm. "I can't do this anymore," I said. "I want a divorce." She looked up at me, her eyes wide, as if she hadn't seen this coming. "Mark, wait." "No," I cut her off, my voice firmer than I expected. "I've waited long enough. I've given you time to explain, to make amends, to show me that this marriage means something to you. But all I see is someone who checked out a long time ago. You made your choice, Pam. Now I'm making mine." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw genuine regret in her expression. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to lose you." I wanted to believe her. God, a part of me still wanted to believe we could fix this. But the damage was done. Even if she meant those words, they came too late. "I've already lost you," I said quietly. "The person I thought you were, the life I thought we had, it's gone. And I can't pretend otherwise." She didn't fight me after that, at least not then. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "I'm sorry." But her apology didn't change my resolve. I knew I had to act quickly, while I still had the strength to follow through. That same day, I contacted my lawyer friend, Greg, and asked him to help me file for divorce. He didn't ask a lot of questions, just listened, nodded, and told me he'd handle it. Next, I started taking stock of our finances. I wasn't about to let Pam, or her new boyfriend, walk away with more than her fair share. I went through our accounts, canceled joint credit cards, and froze any assets that could be manipulated. I listed the house for sale, knowing I couldn't stay there and knowing I didn't want her to have it either. Pam didn't take those moves well. She accused me of being petty, of trying to punish her. Maybe she was right. Maybe part of me was lashing out, trying to reclaim some sense of power in a situation where I'd felt utterly powerless. But it wasn't just about revenge, it was about protecting myself, about making sure I came out of this with some semblance of stability. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself adjusting to the idea of life without Pam. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if I'd made the right decision, if I'd given up too quickly. But then I'd remember the pain of seeing her with someone else, the lies she told, the way she blamed me for her choices. And I knew I couldn't go back. This was my new reality. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was starting to take control of my life again. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine. I didn't know what the future held, but I was ready to face it. Alone, if I had to. Stronger, I hoped. And maybe, someday, even happy. Once I set the divorce in motion, reality hit hard. The logistics of dismantling a life intertwined with someone else's were overwhelming. I had to sort through years of shared memories, financial entanglements, and the practicalities of moving on. It was like trying to untangle a knotted ball of string, one frustrating strand at a time. The house was the first thing to go. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but it had been our place. Every corner held a memory, good, bad, or now tainted. The living room, where we'd spent countless nights curled up watching movies. The kitchen, where we'd argued about everything from grocery lists to what kind of countertops we should install. The bedroom, where, well, that memory was the hardest to confront. Listing the house was painful but necessary. Pam didn't fight me on it. In fact, she seemed resigned to the whole process, as if selling the house was the final acknowledgement that our marriage was over. Still, seeing the "for sale" sign go up in the front yard felt like the closing of a chapter one hadn't been ready to end. Then there were the finances. Splitting assets wasn't just a legal process, it was a battlefield. Every conversation with Greg, my lawyer, felt like strategizing for war. Pam had her own attorney, of course, and she wasn't shy about trying to claim her share. I remember one particularly heated exchange during mediation. Pam's lawyer pushed for her to keep the car, even though I'd been the one making the payments. She needs it for work, her lawyer argued. She can buy her own car, I shot back. She's been resourceful enough to carry on an affair, I'm sure she can manage a vehicle without my help. Pam winced at that, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But the anger and betrayal still burned too brightly for me to care. The division of our belongings was equally grueling. Furniture, appliances, even the stupid coffee maker, it all had to be decided. I ended up walking away with less than I'd hoped for, but I was okay with that. I didn't want the things that reminded me of her. As all of this played out, Pam became more distant. She stopped making small talk or attempting to smooth things over. Instead, she focused on her own interests, leaving me to navigate the wreckage. One night, while packing up boxes in the garage, I stumbled upon a photo album I hadn't seen in years. It was from our honeymoon, pictures of us laughing on a beach, her head resting on my shoulder as the sun set behind us. I sat there, staring at the photos, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and bitterness. How had we gone from that to this? Had it all been a lie, or had we just lost our way somewhere along the line? I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, I closed the album and set it aside. Holding on to those memories wouldn't change what had happened. It wouldn't bring back the trust or erase the betrayal. If anything, it only reinforced what I already knew, the only way forward was through. Despite the emotional toll, there was something strangely liberating about the process. Each box packed, each document signed, felt like another step toward reclaiming my life. It was painful, yes, but also necessary. By the time the house sold and the divorce was finalized, I felt like I'd aged a decade. But I also felt lighter, like I was finally shedding the weight of everything Pam had done, and everything I'd been holding on to. It wasn't just about ending the marriage. It was about starting over. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like that might actually be possible. Just as I was beginning to feel like I was piecing my life back together, a new storm rolled in, this one far more chaotic and dangerous than the last. Pam's lover, who I'd only ever referred to in my head as the biker, decided he had unfinished business with me. His real name was Rick, though calling him that felt too ordinary for someone who looked like he'd stepped out of a bad action movie. He was built like a tank, covered in tattoos, and rode with a group of equally intimidating men who seemed to have nothing better to do than wreak havoc. The first encounter happened late one night, shortly after the house sale closed. I was leaving my lawyer's office, a stack of finalized divorce papers in hand, when I spotted him leaning against his motorcycle in the parking lot. He was smoking a cigarette, his eyes locked on me as I approached my car. "Mark Davis," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like he'd gargled with gravel. I didn't respond right away. My instincts told me to keep walking, but I knew better than to turn my back on someone like him. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. He took a long drag of his cigarette, then flicked it to the ground, crushing it under his boot. "You've been making things hard for Pam." I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening on the stack of papers. Pam made things hard for herself. She cheated, not me. Rick chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You don't get it, do you? She's with me now. You don't mess with her finances, her house, or anything else. You've done enough damage." The audacity of his words hit me like a slap in the face. "You think I'm the one who's done the damage?" I shot back. "You're kidding, right? She ruined our marriage, and you helped. Don't stand there and try to lecture me about damage." His face darkened, and he took a step closer, his sheer size making me feel like a twig in a hurricane. "Careful, Davis. You don't want to make me angry." I wasn't stupid. I knew I couldn't physically take on someone like him, let alone whatever backup he might have lurking around. But I also knew I couldn't back down, not completely. "This is over," I said firmly. "She made her choices, and now she's dealing with the consequences. You don't scare me." That last part wasn't entirely true, but I wasn't about to let him see that. Rick stared me down for what felt like an eternity, then finally stepped back. "You'd better hope we don't cross paths again," he muttered before climbing onto his bike and roaring off into the night. I stood there for a while, my heart pounding as I tried to process what had just happened. Rick wasn't just a rebound or a fling, he was trouble, and he wasn't going to go away quietly. Over the next few weeks, the harassment escalated. My car tires were slashed one morning, leaving me stranded. A brick was thrown through my apartment window with a note attached, "Stay out of our business." Once, I caught two of Rick's buddies hanging around the parking lot, laughing and muttering something about how easy it would be to find me if they wanted to. I reported everything to the police, of course, but there was only so much they could do without catching anyone in the act. "We'll keep an eye on it," the officer said, though I could tell he wasn't optimistic. The fear was constant, an undercurrent to every moment of my day. But it wasn't just fear that kept me awake at night, it was anger. These men thought they could intimidate me, bully me into submission, and I hated the helplessness that came with it. One evening, after a particularly unnerving encounter with two bikers tailing me home, I made a decision. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one, but on my terms, not theirs. I started taking precautions, installing cameras around my apartment, changing my daily routines, and even keeping a small bat in my car, just in case. I wasn't looking for trouble, but I wasn't going to sit back and let them walk all over me, either. Pam's betrayal had already taken so much from me. I wasn't about to let Rick and his gang take anything more. The tension with Rick and his biker gang reached its boiling point a few weeks later. By then, their harassment had escalated from slashed tires and threatening notes to more overt, dangerous encounters. I knew it was only a matter of time before things got physical, but I wasn't prepared for how quickly it would happen. It was a Friday night, and I had just returned home from the grocery store. My arms were full of bags when I noticed the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles approaching. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I glanced toward the street and saw 3 bikes pulling up in front of my apartment building, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Rick was at the front, flanked by 2 of his goons. He dismounted his bike and started walking toward me, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. The other 2 followed, their expressions cold and predatory. "Mark Davis," Rick called out, his voice carrying an edge of menace. "We need to have a little chat." I set the grocery bags down on the pavement, my heart pounding. "I've got nothing to say to you," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. Rick laughed, a low, humorless sound. "Oh, I think you do. See, you've been making life real hard for Pam. Selling the house, freezing accounts, dragging her through court. It's time you paid for that." I took a step back, my mind racing. My apartment was just a few feet away, but there was no way I'd make it inside before they caught me. And even if I did, a locked door wouldn't stop them. "What's the plan here?" I asked, trying to buy time. "You're just going to beat me up in the middle of the street? Think that's going to make Pam's life easier?" Rick's smile faded, replaced by a sneer. "This isn't about Pam anymore. This is about respect. You disrespected me, and now you're going to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong people." He lunged at me without warning, his fist connecting with my jaw before I could react. The impact sent me stumbling back against my car, stars dancing in my vision. The other two moved in quickly, grabbing my arms to hold me in place as Rick threw another punch, this one landing squarely in my stomach. Pain exploded through my ribs, but adrenaline kicked in, sharpening my focus. I twisted hard, breaking free of their grip and grabbing the small bat I kept stashed in my car. I swung wildly, catching one of them in the shoulder. He yelped in pain, stumbling back, but the other one tackled me before I could swing again. The fight was chaotic, a blur of fists, boots, and shouts. I don't remember much of it, just the raw, animalistic need to survive. Somehow, I managed to land a solid hit on Rick, the bat connecting with his side. He cursed loudly, doubling over, and for a brief moment, I thought I might actually get out of this alive. Then the siren started. The bikers froze, their heads snapping toward the street as the flashing lights of a police car rounded the corner. Rick snarled something under his breath and motioned for the others to retreat. They jumped on their bikes and roared off into the night, leaving me slumped against my car, battered and bleeding but alive. The officers rushed over, their expressions a mix of concern and urgency. "What happened here?" one of them asked, his flashlight scanning the scene. I took a shaky breath, wincing at the pain in my ribs. "I was attacked," I managed to say. "3 guys. One of them was Rick, Pam's boyfriend." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You're the one who's filed multiple reports about harassment, right?" I nodded, too exhausted to say much else. "All right," he said. "Let's get you checked out. And this time, we'll see if we can finally nail these guys." As they took my statement and helped me to the ambulance that had just arrived, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and frustration. I was still standing, still breathing, but this fight was far from over. Rick and his gang had crossed a line, and now it wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about making sure they paid for what they'd done. This wasn't going to end until one of us walked away for good. The attack left me battered, bruised, and angrier than I'd ever been in my life. The pain in my ribs reminded me of what Rick and his gang had done, but it was the anger that kept me up at night. They weren't just coming after me anymore, they were trying to intimidate me into submission. But I wasn't about to let them win. The police filed a report, but I could tell from their tone that they didn't have much hope of catching Rick or his gang. "Without solid evidence or witnesses, it's going to be hard to press charges," the officer had said, almost apologetically. They promised to increase patrols in the area and advised me to take precautions. That was their version of help. I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. The first thing I did was upgrade my security. Cameras weren't enough anymore. I installed motion sensors around my apartment and reinforced the locks on my doors and windows. I even bought a personal alarm and started carrying pepper spray whenever I left the house. It wasn't much, but it made me feel like I had some control over my safety. I also started keeping a detailed log of every encounter with Rick and his gang, dates, times, descriptions of what happened. If the police needed evidence, I'd make sure they had it. But Rick wasn't finished with me. A week after the attack, I found a dead rat on my doorstep, its body crudely wrapped in a bandana with a biker gang emblem on it. The message was clear: they were still watching me, still trying to break me. The harassment escalated from there. My car was vandalized again, this time with obscenities spray-painted across the hood. My mail started disappearing, and I suspected they were behind it. One night, I heard the rumble of motorcycles outside my apartment and saw their silhouettes in the distance, just watching. The constant fear and paranoia began to take its toll. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work. Every time I left the house, I felt like I was being followed. My world had shrunk to the size of my apartment, and even there, I didn't feel completely safe. I knew I needed to fight back, but how? Rick and his gang operated in the shadows, hiding behind the anonymity of their group. They were a wall I couldn't seem to break through. Then, one night, I had an idea. I remembered something Pam had mentioned years ago, back when our conversations were still open and honest. Rick wasn't just some random biker, he was the leader of his gang, and they had a reputation for running illegal operations. Drugs, stolen goods, you name it. They weren't just bullies, they were criminals. I started digging. Late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I scoured the internet for any information I could find about Rick's gang. I found local news articles about police busts, rumors on community forums, and even social media posts from people bragging about their association with the gang. It wasn't much, but it was enough to paint a picture of their activities. I reached out to a friend of mine, Jake, who worked in private security. He owed me a favor, and I cashed it in. Jake wasn't just a security expert, he had connections in law enforcement. I gave him everything I'd found, along with my log of incidents, and asked if he could help me build a case against Rick and his gang. "You're playing with fire," Jake warned me. "These guys don't mess around." "I know," I said. "But they started this, and I'm not going to let them finish it." Jake agreed to help, and within a few days, he'd uncovered more than I expected. Rick's gang had a reputation with the police, but they'd always managed to stay one step ahead. Jake thought my information could tip the scales, especially if we tied Rick directly to the harassment. I handed everything over to the police, this time with Jake's connections giving my case more weight. The officers took it seriously now, and they promised to investigate. But even as I felt the tide turning, I knew Rick wouldn't back off easily. The stakes were higher now, for both of us. And the next time we crossed paths, I had a feeling it wouldn't end without someone getting seriously hurt, or worse. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was on the offensive. But with every step forward, the danger grew, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Rick was waiting for the right moment to strike back. I just had to be ready when he did. It didn't take long for Rick to retaliate. He must have known I'd gone to the police, because the harassment stopped being subtle and became a full-blown assault on my life. I woke up one morning to find my car torched in the parking lot, the charred remains soldering as neighbors stood around in shock. The message was clear: this was war. The police were called, of course, and while they filed another report, they didn't seem optimistic about catching Rick or his crew in the act. "Unless we have someone willing to testify or hard evidence tying them to this, our hands are tied," one officer said, his tone almost apologetic. That was the last straw. I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for the next attack, wondering how far Rick was willing to go. It was time to end this, one way or another. The opportunity came faster than I expected. Late one night, I was at home, scrolling through the security camera feed on my phone, when I caught movement outside. The familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the air, and my pulse quickened. I switched to the live feed and saw Rick and two of his men pulling into the parking lot. They weren't just there to intimidate me this time, they were carrying bats and chains, their intentions clear. My first instinct was to call the police, but I knew they wouldn't get there in time. These men were here for blood, and if I didn't act quickly, I might not walk away from this. I grabbed the bat I kept by the door and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. My hands were shaking, but I knew I couldn't let fear control me. If Rick wanted a fight, he was going to get one. I stepped outside, my bat at the ready, and squared my shoulders. "That's far enough," I called out, my voice firm despite the pounding of my heart. Rick grinned, his teeth glinting in the dim light. "Look who finally grew a backbone," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You really think you can take us, Davis?" "I don't have to," I replied, my grip tightening on the bat. "You're on camera. The cops will see everything." Rick's grin faltered for a moment, but then he laughed, a low, menacing sound. "You think a couple of cameras are going to stop us? We're here to teach you a lesson you won't forget." He motioned to his men, and they started advancing toward me. My chest tightened, but I held my ground. "You come any closer," I warned, "and I won't hold back." They didn't stop. The first swing came from one of Rick's men, a heavy-set guy with a chain wrapped around his fist. I ducked just in time, the chain whistling past my head, and retaliated with a quick swing of my bat, catching him in the ribs. He stumbled back with a grunt, clutching his side. Rick was next, charging at me like a bull. He swung his bat, aiming for my head, but I managed to deflect it with my own. The impact sent a jolt of pain through my arms, but I didn't let it slow me down. The fight was chaos, raw, brutal, and unrelenting. I took hits, but I gave as good as I got. My training with the bat paid off, and I managed to hold my own against the three of them, using every ounce of strength and adrenaline to keep them at bay. Then, just as Rick landed a punch that sent me sprawling to the ground, the sound of sirens filled the air. The cavalry had arrived. The bikers froze, their heads snapping toward the flashing lights as police cars screeched into the parking lot. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, shouting commands for everyone to drop their weapons and get on the ground. Rick hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking between me and the approaching officers. Then, with a snarl, he dropped his bat and raised his hands. His men followed suit, the fight draining out of them as they realized they'd lost. I stayed where I was, struggling to catch my breath as the officers took the bikers into custody. One of them helped me to my feet, his expression a mix of concern and admiration. "You're lucky we got here when we did," he said. "That could have gone a lot worse." "I wasn't going to let them win," I replied, my voice hoarse but steady. As the bikers were loaded into the squad cars, Rick shot me a venomous glare. "This isn't over, Davis," he spat. "You'll regret this." But I knew it was over. For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The fight had taken its toll, but I'd stood my ground, and Rick's reign of terror was finally at an end. The officers assured me that the evidence from my security cameras, combined with the reports I'd filed and the testimony I could provide, would be enough to put Rick and his men behind bars for a long time. As I stood there, watching the police cars disappear into the night, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The battle was over, but the scars it left, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something else too, hope. Hope that I could finally move on, rebuild, and reclaim the life that Rick and Pam had tried to take from me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was fighting back. And I was ready to start living again. The aftermath of the final confrontation with Rick and his gang was a whirlwind of police reports, court dates, and lawyers. My body was bruised, my ribs aching from the fight, but the mental toll of what came next was just as exhausting. Rick and his men were facing a slew of charges: assault, harassment, property damage, and more. My detailed log of incidents, combined with the footage from my security cameras, painted a damning picture of their campaign of intimidation. The police had also tied Rick to several other criminal activities, including drug trafficking and illegal weapons possession, which only strengthened their case. I was called to testify at the preliminary hearings, a nerve-wracking experience that forced me to relive every painful detail. As I sat on the stand, recounting the months of harassment and violence, I could feel Rick's eyes boring into me from across the courtroom. His presence was a dark cloud, a constant reminder of the danger he posed. But this time, I wasn't alone. The prosecutor was relentless, presenting the evidence I'd gathered and bringing in witnesses who had seen the bikers loitering near my apartment or heard the commotion during the attack. Even Jake, my friend in private security, testified about the gang's criminal history and their intimidation tactics. Rick's defense attorney tried to paint me as the aggressor, claiming I provoked the gang by interfering in Pam's life and reporting them to the police. But their argument fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The turning point came when the prosecutor played the security footage of the final attack. The grainy video showed Rick and his men advancing on me with weapons, their intentions clear. It was hard to argue self-defense when they were the ones bringing bats and chains to a fight. Rick's sneer turned to a scowl as the judge denied his bail, citing the violent nature of his crimes and the risk he posed to the community. Watching him being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs was a moment of quiet vindication. But the legal battle didn't end there. Pam decided to make her move, filing a civil suit against me for emotional distress. She claimed that my actions during the divorce, selling the house, freezing accounts, and reporting Rick's gang, had caused her undue hardship. At first, I was furious. The audacity of her claim, after everything she'd put me through, was almost laughable. But as my lawyer, Greg, reminded me, it wasn't about logic or fairness, it was about money. Pam was grasping at straws, hoping to squeeze something out of me before the dust settled. We fought back with equal ferocity. Greg presented evidence of Pam's infidelity, her involvement with Rick, and the numerous ways she had lied and manipulated throughout the divorce. Her lawsuit fell apart under scrutiny, and the judge dismissed it with prejudice, warning her against wasting the court's time with frivolous claims. That victory felt even sweeter than Rick's arrest. It wasn't just about winning, it was about finally cutting the last thread tying me to Pam's toxicity. By the time the criminal trial ended, Rick and his gang were handed sentences that ranged from several years to over a decade in prison. The judge made it clear that their actions had been deliberate and malicious, and they would be held accountable. When it was all over, I walked out of the courthouse with a sense of closure I hadn't felt in months. The legal system, for all its flaws, had finally worked in my favor. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I could breathe again. The constant fear and anxiety were gone, replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild my life. Rick and Pam had tried to destroy me, but they hadn't succeeded. I was still standing, stronger and wiser for the battles I'd fought. And now, with the worst behind me, I was ready to start living on my own terms. The day after the courtroom battles ended, I woke up to a strange feeling, a quiet, almost unfamiliar sense of peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, there were no looming threats, no urgent calls from lawyers, and no rumble of motorcycles echoing in my mind. The chaos that had consumed my life for months was finally behind me, leaving a void I wasn't sure how to fill. Rebuilding started small. My apartment, once a sanctuary turned battleground, felt like it needed a fresh start. I sold off some of the furniture Pam and I had bought together and replaced it with things that felt like me. Bright, bold colors instead of the neutral tones she'd always insisted on. A new couch, a better mattress, and finally, a set of curtains that didn't remind me of her. The act of reclaiming my space was more cathartic than I'd expected. With each change, the apartment began to feel less like a reminder of what I'd lost and more like a symbol of what I was gaining, a fresh start, free from the weight of the past. Work became a welcome escape. I threw myself into projects, taking on new challenges and responsibilities. My colleagues noticed the shift, and for the first time in months, their questions weren't about my well-being but about my ideas and contributions. It felt good to be seen as more than the guy going through a messy divorce. Socially, I started to reconnect with friends I'd neglected during the worst of it all. At first, it was just casual meetups, grabbing a beer with Jake to thank him for his help, or dinner with an old college buddy who'd been reaching out for months. But slowly, those small steps turned into something bigger. I started going out more, saying yes to invitations, and rediscovering the simple joy of being around people who cared about me. Therapy also became a part of my routine. At first, I was hesitant. Talking to a stranger about my pain and anger felt like admitting weakness. But my therapist, a calm and insightful woman named Dr. Reed, quickly showed me otherwise. "You've been through a lot, Mark," she said during our first session. "It's okay to feel lost. But this is your chance to redefine what your life looks like. What do you want it to be?" Her question stayed with me long after the session ended. For so long, my life had been defined by my relationship with Pam and the aftermath of her betrayal. Now, with that chapter closed, I had the opportunity to write a new one. I started setting goals for myself, both big and small. Some were practical, saving up to buy a house, taking better care of my health. Others were more personal, like finally going on that hiking trip I'd been talking about for years or learning to cook something other than spaghetti and frozen pizza. And then there was the hardest goal of all, learning to trust again. It wasn't just about trusting other people, it was about trusting myself. Pam's betrayal had shaken my confidence, making me question my judgment and my worth. But as I worked through those feelings with Dr. Reed, I began to see that her actions weren't a reflection of me. They were her choices, her failures, her flaws. Little by little, I started to believe in myself again. One day, while sorting through a box of old photos and mementos, I found a note I'd written to myself years ago, back when Pam and I were first married. It was a simple reminder of the person I wanted to be, strong, kind, driven, and unafraid to take risks. Reading it now, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. That man wasn't gone, he was still there, buried under layers of hurt and doubt. And now, it was time to bring him back. The past few months had been a crucible, testing me in ways I never thought possible. But as I stood on the other side of it, I realized something important: I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was growing, evolving, and rediscovering who I was. Rebuilding my life wasn't easy, but it was worth every step. For the first time in years, I felt like the future was mine to shape. And I wasn't going to let anything, or anyone, hold me back. As I worked on rebuilding my life, there came a point when I couldn't avoid the thought of dating again. It wasn't something I actively pursued at first, it felt too soon, too raw, but the idea lingered in the back of my mind. Dr. Reed encouraged me to take things slowly, reminding me that trust wasn't something I had to rush back into. "Start small," she said during one of our sessions. "It's not about finding the one right now. It's about proving to yourself that you're capable of connection again." That advice stuck with me. So when a friend set me up on a casual coffee date with a woman named Claire, I hesitantly agreed. Claire was nothing like Pam. Where Pam had been bold and outgoing, Claire was soft-spoken and thoughtful. She worked as a teacher and had a warm, genuine smile that put me at ease almost immediately. Our conversation flowed naturally, covering everything from favorite movies to childhood memories. But as enjoyable as the date was, I couldn't ignore the voice in the back of my head whispering doubts. Every time Claire asked a personal question, I felt myself hesitate, wondering if I was saying too much or giving away too little. The scars from my past made it hard to relax, and I found myself analyzing every word, every gesture, for hidden meaning. Claire must have noticed my guardedness because, toward the end of the date, she leaned forward and said, "You've been through something, haven't you?" Her question caught me off guard. I wasn't sure how to respond, but her tone was gentle, not probing. "Yeah," I admitted after a pause. "It's complicated." She smiled, her eyes kind. "Aren't we all? You don't have to explain. Just know it's okay to take your time." That simple reassurance meant more to me than she probably realized. It reminded me that not everyone was out to hurt me, that there were still good, honest people in the world. We parted ways with a promise to meet again, though I wasn't sure if I was ready for anything serious. What I did know was that I'd taken a step forward, however small, toward trusting someone new. In the weeks that followed, I went on a few more dates, some with Claire and others with women I met through friends or online. Not all of them went well. There were awkward silences, mismatched interests, and even one date who spent the entire evening talking about her ex. But each experience taught me something about myself and what I was looking for. More importantly, they taught me that it was okay to be vulnerable. One night, after a particularly good date with Claire, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. Just months ago, I'd been consumed by anger and distrust, convinced that love wasn't worth the risk. Now, while I wasn't rushing into anything, I could see the possibility of something new, something better, on the horizon. It wasn't just about dating, though. It was about rebuilding my faith in humanity, in relationships, and in myself. Every interaction, every laugh, every moment of connection chipped away at the walls I'd built around my heart. I knew the journey wasn't over. Trust was still fragile, something I had to nurture and protect. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. Claire and I continued seeing each other, keeping things light and uncomplicated. She didn't push for more than I was ready to give, and I appreciated her patience. Whether or not our relationship would last, I didn't know. What mattered was that she reminded me of what was possible, that trust, love, and hope weren't beyond my reach. This chapter of my life was still being written, but it no longer felt like a story of betrayal and loss. It was becoming a story of resilience, growth, and the quiet courage it takes to start again. As time went on, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future. The bitterness that had once consumed me was beginning to fade, replaced by something quieter, steadier, a determination to live a life that felt meaningful and authentic. I poured more energy into things that brought me joy. Work remained a constant, but I began setting aside time for the passions I'd neglected during my marriage. Photography, something I'd loved in college but abandoned when life got busy, made a triumphant return. I spent weekends exploring nature trails, camera in hand, capturing moments of beauty that reminded me the world was bigger than my problems. One evening, while flipping through some of my recent photos, I had an idea. What if I could turn this hobby into something more? Not just for myself, but for others. That's how I found myself volunteering with a local nonprofit that provided photography workshops for at-risk youth. The organization's goal was to give these kids a creative outlet, a way to tell their stories through images. I wasn't sure what to expect when I first signed up, but the experience turned out to be one of the most rewarding things I'd ever done. The kids were incredible, curious, talented, and full of raw, untapped potential. Watching them light up as they captured a perfect shot or experimented with new techniques reminded me why I'd fallen in love with photography in the first place. One boy in particular, Malik, stuck with me. He was quiet at first, keeping to himself and barely engaging during the workshops. But when I handed him an old DSLR camera and showed him how to use it, something shifted. His eyes lit up, and he spent the rest of the session snapping photos of anything and everything around him. At the end of the day, he came up to me, holding the camera tightly. "Do you think I'm good at this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not just good," I told him. "You've got an eye for this. Keep at it, and you could be great." His smile was small but genuine, and in that moment, I realized how much I'd needed this experience, not just to help these kids, but to remind myself of what I was capable of. Outside of volunteering, I also reconnected with my community. I joined a local hiking group, started attending events at the library, and even signed up for a cooking class. Each new activity brought with it new faces, new stories, and new opportunities to grow. Through it all, Claire remained a quiet, supportive presence in my life. We didn't rush into anything, but her companionship helped me see that not all relationships had to be complicated or painful. Sometimes, they could just be. One night, over dinner, she asked me, "What do you want your life to look like in 5 years?" The question caught me off guard. For so long, I'd been focused on just getting through the day. But as I thought about it, I realized I finally had an answer. "I want to keep creating," I said. "I want to help people, stay connected to the things I love, and surround myself with people who make life better." It was a simple answer, but it felt right. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost or what might go wrong. I was thinking about what I wanted, and how to make it happen. That night, I made a promise to myself: no more dwelling on the past. No more letting fear or anger dictate my choices. My life was mine to shape, and I was determined to make it something I could be proud of. Pam and Rick had taken so much from me, but they hadn't taken everything. They hadn't taken my ability to rebuild, to find joy, to rediscover my purpose. And as I looked ahead, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving. And I was finally ready to do just that. The journey wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. Months after the dust had settled, I stood at the edge of a rocky overlook on a trail I'd been hiking with my new group. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe deeply, without the weight of the past pressing down on my chest. Life had found a rhythm again, one that felt authentic and intentional. The chaos of the past year was now a memory, a chapter I'd written, closed, and learned from. Rick and his gang were behind bars, Pam had faded into the background of my life, and the scars they'd left behind were healing, one day at a time. Claire and I had grown closer, but we weren't rushing anything. She understood the importance of giving me space to rebuild myself, and for that, I was grateful. Our relationship wasn't about filling a void or fixing what had been broken, it was about companionship, laughter, and the possibility of something more. The photography workshops with the nonprofit had become a staple in my life. Watching those kids find joy and confidence in their art brought me a sense of fulfillment I hadn't known I needed. Malik, the quiet boy with the knack for capturing stunning shots, had become one of the program's stars. His photos were being featured in a community gallery, and seeing his pride made me realize just how much impact a single act of kindness could have. I even found myself dreaming bigger, starting my own photography business or expanding the workshops to reach more kids. The idea of leaving a legacy, of contributing something meaningful to the world, was no longer just a fantasy. But the biggest change wasn't what I was doing, it was how I felt about myself. I wasn't defined by Pam's betrayal anymore. I wasn't the angry, broken man I'd been in the aftermath of her affair. I wasn't even the cautious, guarded person I'd become during the fight with Rick. I was someone new, someone stronger. I had learned to trust again, not just other people, but myself. The lessons from the past were still there, of course. I hadn't forgotten the pain, the betrayal, or the fear. But those experiences had shaped me into someone resilient, someone who knew how to set boundaries, recognize red flags, and prioritize my own well-being. As I stood on that overlook, watching the sun sink below the horizon, I thought about the advice I'd give to someone going through what I had. Life isn't fair, and people will hurt you. But pain doesn't have to define you. You can learn from it, grow through it, and come out the other side stronger than you ever thought possible. Pam and Rick had tried to destroy me, but they hadn't succeeded. I'd survived, I'd rebuilt, and now, I was thriving. The future wasn't certain, and that was okay. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what was ahead. I was ready for it, ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength, courage, and determination to handle it. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take me.